The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as 8-year-old Prince Alexander made his way through the marble corridors. His small feet echoed against the polished floors as he wandered away from his tutors, seeking adventure in the quiet corners of the royal residence. The palace was enormous, with countless rooms and hidden passages that fascinated the curious young prince. Alexander had always been different from other royal children. While his cousins played with expensive toys and demanded attention from servants, he preferred to explore and observe. His keen eyes noticed things that adults often missed, and his kind heart felt deeply for others, regardless of their station in life. On this particular morning, the prince had escaped from his mathematics lesson. Numbers and equations bored him terribly, and he much preferred the real world to the confines of the classroom. His tutor, Mr. Pemberton, would surely scold him later, but Alexander didn't care. The palace held too many mysteries for him to sit still and memorize multiplication tables. As he rounded a corner near the servants' quarters, Alexander heard an unusual sound. It was soft at first, almost like the wind whistling through the windows, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was someone crying. The sound was coming from a small alcove near the palace's eastern gate, where the royal guards usually took their breaks. Curiosity overtook caution as Alexander crept closer to investigate. He pressed himself against the cool stone wall and peered around the corner. What he saw made his young heart ache with sympathy. There, sitting on a wooden bench with his head in his hands, was Thomas Hartwell, one of the palace guards. Alexander recognized him immediately. Thomas was young, perhaps 25 years old, with kind brown eyes and a gentle smile that he always shared with the prince when their paths crossed. Unlike some of the stern older guards, Thomas never seemed annoyed when Alexander asked questions or got in the way during his explorations. But now, Thomas looked nothing like the cheerful guard Alexander knew. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, and his usually pristine uniform was wrinkled and unkempt. His rifle lay forgotten against the wall, and his cap had fallen to the ground beside his feet. The sight of such distress in someone he considered a friend troubled Alexander deeply. The prince remained hidden, unsure whether he should approach or quietly leave Thomas to his privacy. Royal children were taught from an early age that servants and guards were there to serve them, not to burden them with personal problems. But Alexander had never been comfortable with such rigid social boundaries. He saw people as individuals, not merely as their roles within the palace hierarchy. As he watched, Thomas pulled a crumpled letter from his pocket and read it again, which only seemed to intensify his grief. Fresh tears streamed down his face, and he covered his mouth to muffle a sob. The letter appeared to be the source of his distress, though Alexander couldn't make out its contents from his hiding spot. The young prince felt torn between his upbringing and his natural compassion. Everything he had been taught told him to walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Royal children weren't supposed to involve themselves in the personal affairs of the staff. His governess had repeatedly emphasized the importance of maintaining proper distance between the royal family and their employees. But Alexander's heart told him something different. Here was someone in pain, someone who had always been kind to him, and walking away felt wrong. The prince had been blessed with many privileges in life, but with those privileges came responsibilities. His father, the king, had often spoken about the duty of royalty to care for their subjects, though Alexander suspected this wasn't quite what his father had meant. Thomas looked up suddenly, as if sensing he was being watched. For a moment their eyes met across the courtyard. Alexander expected the guard to quickly compose himself and pretend nothing was wrong, as servants usually did when caught in vulnerable moments. Instead, Thomas simply stared at the prince with red-rimmed eyes, too exhausted by grief to put on a false facade. The silence stretched between them, neither sure how to proceed. Alexander could see the internal struggle on Thomas's face as the guard debated whether to acknowledge his distress or attempt to hide it. The letter in his hands trembled slightly, and Alexander noticed the official seal that had been broken on the envelope. Finally, Alexander made his decision. Royal protocol and social expectations meant nothing in the face of human suffering. He stepped out from his hiding place and walked slowly toward the distraught guard, his young face filled with genuine concern. "Thomas," he said softly, his voice carrying a maturity that belied his 8 years. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" The guard's eyes widened in surprise at the prince's direct approach. He quickly wiped his face with his sleeve and attempted to stand, but Alexander gestured for him to remain seated. The normal formalities felt inappropriate given the circumstances. "Your Highness," Thomas began, his voice hoarse from crying. I didn't expect anyone to—" "I should return to my duties." He reached for his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly to grip it properly. "Please don't go," Alexander said, settling himself on the bench beside the guard without any regard for the dirt that might soil his expensive clothes. "Something terrible has happened, hasn't it?" "Maybe I can help." Thomas looked at the young prince with amazement. In all his years of service at the palace, no member of the royal family had ever shown such direct concern for his well-being. The boy's simple act of sitting beside him, treating him as an equal rather than a subordinate, touched something deep in the grieving guard's heart. "I don't think there's anything anyone can do, Your Highness," Thomas replied quietly, clutching the letter tighter. "Some things in life just can't be fixed, no matter how much we might wish otherwise." Alexander studied the guard's face carefully, noting the deep lines of worry and the way Thomas's shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. The prince had seen similar expressions on his father's face during times of crisis, when matters of state weighed heavily on the king's mind. But this seemed different, more personal and devastating. "Is it bad news in that letter?" Alexander asked gently, nodding toward the paper in Thomas's hands. Thomas glanced down at the letter as if he had forgotten he was holding it. A fresh wave of emotion crossed his features and he nodded slowly, unable to speak for a moment. "The worst kind of news, Your Highness," he finally managed. "The kind that changes everything and leaves you wondering how you'll ever find the strength to continue." The prince felt his own eyes beginning to water as he witnessed Thomas's pain. Though he was only 8 years old, Alexander possessed an unusual capacity for empathy that allowed him to feel others' emotions almost as intensely as his own. Whatever was in that letter had devastated this kind man, and Alexander felt compelled to do something about it. Thomas stared at the letter in his trembling hands, wondering if he should share his burden with the young prince. Everything about royal protocol suggested he should excuse himself politely and deal with his problems privately. Guards weren't supposed to trouble members of the royal family with personal matters, especially not a child. But something in Alexander's earnest expression made him reconsider. "Your Highness," Thomas began hesitantly, "this letter is from my village. It's about my family." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and he had to pause to collect himself. "I'm afraid the news is quite serious." Alexander scooted closer on the bench, his young face filled with concern. "What happened to your family, Thomas? Are they hurt?" The guard looked down at the official seal on the envelope, remembering the moment he had broken it open just minutes earlier. The news had hit him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling and unable to think clearly. He had stumbled to this quiet corner of the palace to process what he had read, never expecting to encounter the prince. "My father owns a small farm in the northern province," Thomas explained slowly. "Well, he owned it. According to this letter from the village magistrate, there's been a terrible drought this summer. The crops have failed completely, and my father can't pay his debts to the landowner." Alexander listened intently, his young mind trying to understand the implications of what Thomas was telling him. He had heard his father and the royal advisors discussing agricultural problems in various provinces, but it had always seemed like abstract numbers and statistics. Now, seeing the real human cost of these issues reflected in Thomas's face, the problems became painfully real. "What happens when someone can't pay their debts?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The family loses everything," Thomas replied quietly. "The farm, the house, all their possessions. My parents, my 2 younger sisters, and my elderly grandmother will be turned out with nowhere to go. In 3 days, according to this letter, they'll be homeless." The prince felt a knot forming in his stomach as he imagined Thomas's family facing such a terrible fate. He thought of his own grandmother, who lived in comfort in the palace's royal apartments, and tried to picture her being forced from her home with no place to go. The image was heartbreaking. "How much money do they owe?" Alexander asked, hoping it might be an amount he could help with from his own allowance. Thomas let out a bitter laugh that held no humor. 300 gold pieces? It might as well be 3 million. I send home what I can from my guard's salary, but it's barely enough to help with food and basic necessities. I could work for 10 years and never save that much money." The sum was staggering to the young prince. His weekly allowance was 5 silver pieces, which had always seemed generous to him. To earn 300 gold pieces would take him years, far too long to help Thomas's family, but Alexander's mind was already working on other possibilities. "Why didn't your father write to you directly?" Alexander asked, noticing that the letter came from a magistrate rather than family. "My father can't read or write," Thomas explained, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "None of my family can. They had to ask the village magistrate to send word to the palace. By the time this letter traveled here, there are only 3 days left before the landowner seizes everything." Alexander's heart sank as he realized how hopeless the situation seemed. Even if there were a way to help, 3 days wasn't enough time to organize anything significant. The slow pace of royal bureaucracy meant that even simple requests could take weeks to process. "Have you asked the captain of the guards for leave to go home?" Alexander suggested. Thomas shook his head sadly. "I can't abandon my post without permission, and getting permission takes time I don't have. Besides, even if I could go home, what would I do when I got there? Watch them pack their few belongings and leave? I don't have the money to help them, and my presence would only make their shame worse." The guard's words were filled with such despair that Alexander felt tears forming in his own eyes. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to serving the royal family, standing watch day and night to protect them, and yet he was powerless to protect his own family when they needed him most. "There has to be something we can do," Alexander said firmly, his young voice carrying a determination that surprised Thomas. "My father always says that every problem has a solution if you're clever enough to find it." Thomas looked at the earnest young prince with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Your Highness, I appreciate your kindness more than you know, but some problems are too big for cleverness to solve. This is simply the way of the world for people like my family." "No," Alexander said sharply, standing up from the bench with sudden resolve. "That's not right. You serve our family faithfully. You've always been kind to me, even when other guards ignore me or treat me like I'm just a bother. You deserve better than this." The prince began pacing back and forth in front of the bench, his young mind racing through possibilities. He thought about all the resources available in the palace, all the wealth and power that surrounded him daily. Surely there had to be a way to use some of that power to help one loyal guard save his family. "What if I talk to my father?" Alexander suggested suddenly. "The king could order the landowner to give your family more time, or he could provide the money they need." Thomas's expression grew troubled at the suggestion. "Your Highness, I couldn't ask you to do that. The king has important matters of state to worry about. The problems of one guard's family aren't significant enough to trouble him with." "But you're not just any guard," Alexander protested. "You're part of our household. You protect us every day. Doesn't that make your family's welfare important too?" The guard was touched by the prince's loyalty, but he also understood the realities of palace life better than the 8-year-old boy. "The king receives hundreds of petitions every month from subjects asking for help with their problems. If he helped everyone who asked, the royal treasury would be empty within a year. There have to be limits even on royal generosity." Alexander frowned at this explanation, frustrated by the constraints that seemed to govern every aspect of royal life. He had been born into enormous privilege, surrounded by wealth and luxury that most people could never imagine. Yet when faced with a simple problem that money could easily solve, he felt powerless to act. "Then what about the other guards?" Alexander asked, grasping for any solution. "Could they contribute money to help your family?" "Most of the guards have families of their own to support," Thomas replied gently. "They're good men, but they don't earn much more than I do. Even if they all contributed what they could spare, it wouldn't be enough to make a real difference." Alexander sat back down on the bench, his shoulders slumping with the weight of the seemingly impossible situation. For the first time in his young life, he was confronting a problem that couldn't be solved by simply asking his parents or using his royal status. The helplessness was a new and uncomfortable feeling for the privileged prince. "I wish I were older," Alexander said quietly. "When I'm king, things will be different. No one who serves our family faithfully will ever have to watch their family suffer like this." Thomas smiled sadly at the young prince's noble intentions. "You have a good heart, Your Highness. That will serve you well when you do become king. But for now, there's nothing either of us can do except accept what fate has decided." But even as Thomas spoke those words of resignation, Alexander's mind was still working, still searching for some angle he hadn't considered yet. The prince possessed a stubborn streak that served him well in situations like this. He wasn't ready to give up, even if the solution wasn't immediately obvious. As they sat together in contemplative silence, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the courtyard. Thomas quickly wiped his face and reached for his rifle, preparing to resume his duties before anyone else discovered him in his moment of weakness. The footsteps belonged to Captain Morrison, the head of the palace guard, making his morning rounds. His stern expression softened slightly when he saw Prince Alexander, but his eyes narrowed as he noticed Thomas's disheveled appearance and red-rimmed eyes. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison said with a respectful bow. "Your tutor is looking for you. He seems quite concerned about your whereabouts." He then turned his attention to Thomas with a much sterner tone. "Guard Hartwell, you appear to be out of uniform. Is there an explanation for your condition?" Thomas scrambled to his feet, hastily adjusting his jacket and attempting to smooth his hair. The letter crumpled further in his nervous grip as he tried to compose himself. "My apologies, Captain. I was just taking a brief rest before returning to my post." Alexander watched the exchange with growing frustration. He could see Thomas struggling to hide his distress, and Captain Morrison's disapproving expression made it clear that the guard would likely face punishment for his appearance. The unfairness of the situation struck the young prince deeply. "Captain Morrison," Alexander said, stepping forward with all the authority his 8-year-old frame could muster. "Thomas has received terrible news about his family. He wasn't being lazy or neglecting his duties. He was upset, and rightfully so." The captain's eyebrows rose in surprise at the prince's intervention. It was unusual for royal children to involve themselves in matters concerning the staff, and Morrison wasn't sure how to respond. "I see," he said carefully. "Well, regardless of the circumstances, we all have duties to perform. His family is about to lose their farm," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "They'll be homeless in 3 days because they can't pay their debts. Thomas has been crying because he can't help them. Wouldn't you be upset if your family was in danger?" Captain Morrison looked uncomfortable with the personal nature of the conversation. He glanced between the prince and Thomas, clearly wishing he hadn't stumbled into this situation. "Your Highness, while I sympathize with any personal difficulties our guards may face, we cannot allow such matters to interfere with palace security." "But what good is palace security if the people providing it are suffering?" Alexander asked, his young voice filled with passion. "How can we expect Thomas to focus on protecting us when he's worried sick about his family?" Thomas looked mortified that his personal problems were being discussed so openly with his superior officer. "Your Highness, please don't concern yourself with my troubles. The captain is right that duty must come first." "No, he's not right," Alexander said firmly, surprising both men with his vehemence. "Duty works both ways. Thomas has a duty to serve us, but we have a duty to care for those who serve us faithfully. My father taught me that a true leader takes responsibility for his people's welfare." Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the wisdom in the young prince's words but also aware of the practical limitations of military discipline. "Your Highness speaks wisely," he said diplomatically. "But individual hardships cannot override the needs of palace security. Perhaps Guard Hartwell could speak with the palace chaplain about his troubles." The suggestion struck Alexander as completely inadequate. Speaking with the chaplain might provide spiritual comfort, but it wouldn't save Thomas's family from homelessness. The prince felt his frustration building as he realized that everyone seemed willing to offer sympathy, but no one was prepared to take action. "What if Thomas had leave to go home?" Alexander asked suddenly. 3 days to try to help his family. Surely the palace can spare one guard for 3 days. Captain Morrison shook his head immediately. "Impossible, Your Highness. We're already short-staffed due to illness, and the upcoming state dinner requires full security protocols. Every guard is essential." Alexander's mind raced as he tried to think of alternative solutions. The state dinner was indeed a major event, with foreign dignitaries expected to attend. Security would be tight, and he understood why Captain Morrison couldn't spare any guards. But understanding the reasoning didn't make it any less frustrating. "Then what about money?" Alexander pressed. Could the palace provide a loan to help his family? Thomas could repay it from his salary over time. The palace doesn't operate a lending institution for staff members, Captain Morrison replied stiffly. Such arrangements would set a dangerous precedent. Every employee with financial troubles would expect similar assistance. Thomas watched this exchange with growing discomfort. While he was touched by the prince's passionate advocacy on his behalf, he also recognized that the young boy was fighting an impossible battle against established procedures and protocols. The guard feared that Alexander's intervention might actually make his situation worse by drawing unwanted attention from palace officials. "Your Highness," Thomas said gently, "I truly appreciate your concern, but perhaps it would be better if you return to your lessons. Your tutor will be worried, and there's really nothing more to be done about my situation." But Alexander wasn't ready to give up. An idea was forming in his mind, sparked by something Captain Morrison had said about setting precedents. The prince realized that he had been thinking about this problem in the wrong way. Instead of asking for special treatment for Thomas, perhaps he needed to think about creating a system that could help all palace employees facing similar hardships. "Captain Morrison," Alexander said with renewed determination, "you mentioned that other guards might face similar problems in the future. What if we created a fund to help palace employees during emergencies? Not loans, but grants for truly desperate situations." The captain looked intrigued, despite himself. "A benevolent fund of some kind? That's an interesting concept, Your Highness, but it would require significant resources and oversight. Such matters would need to be discussed with the king and his advisors." "Then let's discuss it with them," Alexander said immediately. "Today. Right now. This could be the first case handled by the new fund." Thomas's eyes widened at the prince's bold suggestion. The idea of approaching the king directly about his family's problems seemed both terrifying and impossible. "Your Highness, I couldn't ask you to trouble the king with such a request. It wouldn't be appropriate." "You're not asking," Alexander pointed out. "I am, and as a member of the royal family, it's my right to bring important matters to my father's attention." Captain Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. While he admired the prince's compassion, he also understood the potential complications of involving the king in individual staff problems. "Your Highness, perhaps this matter should be discussed more carefully before approaching His Majesty. There are proper channels for such requests." "Proper channels take time," Alexander replied impatiently. "Time that Thomas's family doesn't have. Sometimes leadership means cutting through bureaucracy when people's lives are at stake." The young prince's words carried a maturity that surprised both men. Despite his age, Alexander seemed to instinctively understand principles of leadership that many adults struggled with. His willingness to challenge established procedures in service of doing what was right showed a strength of character that impressed even the skeptical Captain Morrison. "What exactly are you proposing, Your Highness?" the captain asked, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to take the prince's ideas seriously. Alexander's eyes lit up with excitement as he realized he finally had the adult's attention. "I want to speak with my father immediately about creating an emergency assistance fund for palace employees. Thomas's situation can be the test case that proves why such a fund is necessary." "And if the king refuses?" Thomas asked quietly, hardly daring to hope that such an audacious plan might actually work. "Then at least we'll have tried," Alexander replied with conviction. "But I don't think he'll refuse. My father believes in taking care of people who serve our family faithfully. He just needs to understand how urgent this situation is." Captain Morrison sighed deeply, recognizing that the determined young prince was not going to be dissuaded from his course of action. "Very well, Your Highness. If you're truly committed to this approach, I suppose I could arrange an audience with the king. But you must understand that such requests are highly unusual and may not be received favorably." "I understand the risks," Alexander said firmly. "But doing nothing is not an option. Thomas has always been kind to me, and his family deserves our help. If being a prince means anything, it should mean having the power to help good people when they're in trouble." Within an hour, Alexander found himself standing outside the doors of his father's study, his heart pounding with nervous excitement. Captain Morrison had managed to secure a brief audience with King Edmund. though the captain had warned Alexander that the king was in the middle of reviewing important trade agreements and might not have much patience for interruptions. Thomas stood beside the prince, looking thoroughly uncomfortable in his hastily cleaned uniform. He had protested repeatedly that he shouldn't be involved in such a high-level discussion, but Alexander had insisted that the king needed to hear directly from the person affected by the proposed policy. The guard's hands trembled slightly as he held his cap, and Alexander could see the nervous sweat beading on his forehead. "Remember," Alexander whispered to Thomas as they waited, "just tell the truth about your family's situation. My father is a good man, but he needs to understand how serious this is." The massive oak doors opened and King Edmund's personal secretary gestured for them to enter. The study was an impressive room lined with leather-bound books and maps of the kingdom. Behind an enormous mahogany desk sat the king, a man in his early 40s with graying temples and kind but tired eyes. He looked up from his papers as they approached, his expression curious about this unusual request for an audience. "Alexander," the king said warmly, rising from his chair to greet his son, "Captain Morrison tells me you have an urgent matter to discuss. This is rather unusual for you to request a formal audience." Alexander took a deep breath, drawing upon all the lessons in public speaking and diplomacy he had received from his tutors. "Father, I want to talk to you about Thomas Hartwell, one of our palace guards. He's facing a family emergency that I believe demonstrates the need for a new royal policy." King Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly at his son's formal tone and serious demeanor. He gestured for both Alexander and Thomas to sit in the chairs facing his desk, then settled back into his own seat with an expression of polite attention. "I'm listening. Please explain the situation." Alexander nodded to Thomas, encouraging him to speak. The guard cleared his throat nervously before beginning his story. "Your Majesty, I received word today that my family's farm in the northern province is being seized for debt. They owe 300 gold pieces to the landowner and have 3 days to pay or lose everything." The king listened carefully as Thomas explained about the drought, the failed crops, and his family's desperate situation. His expression grew more serious as he understood the implications of what he was hearing. When Thomas finished speaking, King Edmund leaned back in his chair, considering the information thoughtfully. "I'm sorry to hear of your family's troubles, Guard Hartwell," the king said genuinely. "Agricultural failures have been reported throughout the northern provinces this year. Many families are facing similar hardships due to the drought. That's exactly why we need to act," Alexander interjected, his young voice filled with passion. "If many families are suffering like Thomas's, then this isn't just one person's problem. It's a crisis that affects people who serve our kingdom faithfully." King Edmund looked at his son with surprise and interest. "What are you suggesting, Alexander?" The prince stood up from his chair, unable to contain his excitement as he outlined his proposal. "I think we should create an emergency assistance fund for palace employees and their families. When loyal servants face disasters like droughts or illness or other emergencies, they shouldn't have to face them alone." "An interesting idea," the king mused. "But such a fund would require significant resources and careful administration. How would you determine who qualifies for assistance? How would you prevent abuse of such a system?" Alexander had anticipated these questions and had spent the time waiting for the audience thinking through the details. "We could establish clear criteria," he said confidently. "Length of service, nature of the emergency, availability of other resources. Captain Morrison could oversee the applications with help from the palace treasurer." Thomas listened to this exchange with amazement. The young prince was discussing policy matters with the king as if he were a seasoned advisor, rather than an 8-year-old boy. The guard began to hope that perhaps this audacious plan might actually work. "And the funding for such a program?" King Edmund asked, testing his son's understanding of the practical challenges involved. "We could start with a portion of the palace maintenance budget," Alexander replied promptly. "The amount we spend on one state banquet could probably help. Dozens of families like Thomas's. We could also ask wealthy nobles to contribute as a way of showing their loyalty to the crown." The king was clearly impressed by his son's thoughtful approach to the problem. "You've given this considerable thought, Alexander. But tell me, why is this particular case so important to you? Why not simply provide assistance to Guard Hartwell's family without creating an entire new program?" Alexander's expression grew serious as he considered his father's question. Because helping just Thomas, while it would be wonderful, doesn't solve the bigger problem. There are probably other guards, other servants, other people who work for us who are suffering in silence because they don't think they can ask for help. This isn't about charity, Father. It's about responsibility. Responsibility? King Edmund prompted, curious to hear his son's reasoning. People like Thomas dedicate their lives to serving our family, Alexander explained earnestly. They protect us, they maintain our homes, they sacrifice their own comfort for ours. When they face crises, shouldn't we be willing to help them the same way they help us every day? The king was quiet for a long moment, studying both his son and the guard who sat listening to their conversation. Thomas could see the wheels turning in the monarch's mind as he weighed the proposal against competing priorities and practical considerations. "Guard Hartwell," the king said finally, turning his attention to Thomas. "How long have you served in the palace guard?" 6 years, Your Majesty," Thomas replied respectfully. "Since I was 19 years old. It's been an honor to serve your family." "And in those 6 years, have you ever requested special assistance or favors?" "Never, Your Majesty. I've always tried to handle my responsibilities without burdening others." King Edmund nodded approvingly. "Captain Morrison speaks highly of your service record. You're reliable, honest, and well-regarded by your fellow guards." He paused, then asked, "If we were to provide assistance to your family, how would you repay the debt?" Thomas's face fell slightly at the question. "I'm afraid I couldn't repay 300 gold pieces, Your Majesty. My salary is modest, and I already send what I can spare to help my family with their regular expenses. It would take me many years to save such an amount." "I'm not talking about monetary repayment," the king clarified with a slight smile. "I'm asking how you would honor such assistance through your continued service." Hope flickered in Thomas's eyes as he began to understand what the king might be suggesting. "Your Majesty, if you were to help my family, I would dedicate my life to serving the crown with even greater loyalty than before. I would train new guards, take on additional responsibilities, whatever you might require." Alexander watched this exchange with growing excitement, sensing that his father was leaning toward approving the request. The young prince had learned to read his father's expressions over the years, and he could see the compassion and consideration in the king's eyes. "Alexander," the king said, turning back to his son, "your proposal has merit, but implementing such a program would take time. Guard Hartwell's family needs help in 3 days, not 3 months. What do you suggest we do about the immediate crisis?" The prince's heart raced as he realized his father was essentially asking him to make a command decision. This was his opportunity to demonstrate real leadership, to show that his compassion could be paired with practical action. "Provide the money for Thomas's family immediately," Alexander said without hesitation. 300 gold pieces from the royal treasury as an emergency intervention. Then use this case as the foundation for developing the larger assistance program. "And if other employees hear about this assistance and demand similar help?" the king asked, continuing to test his son's reasoning. "Then we evaluate each case fairly and help those who truly deserve it." Alexander replied firmly, "We can't let fear of setting precedents prevent us from doing what's right when good people are in desperate need." King Edmund smiled proudly at his son's confident response. The boy was showing wisdom and leadership skills that impressed even the experienced monarch. "Very well," the king said, making his decision. "I hereby authorize the immediate payment of 300 gold pieces to settle the debt on Guard Hartwell's family farm." Thomas's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude as the king's words sank in. The nightmare that had consumed him all morning was suddenly over, replaced by overwhelming thankfulness to the royal family he served. Thomas dropped to one knee before the king, overwhelmed by emotion and gratitude. "Your Majesty, I don't know how to thank you. You've saved my family from ruin. I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of this kindness." King Edmund gestured for Thomas to rise, his expression warm but serious. "Your years of faithful service have already proven your worth, Guard Hartwell. This assistance is not charity, but recognition of your value to our household and our kingdom." Alexander beamed with pride and relief, but his father wasn't finished speaking. The king turned to his son with an expression that mixed approval with expectation. "Alexander, you've shown remarkable insight and compassion today, but leadership requires following through on one's commitments. I'm placing you in charge of developing this assistance program you've proposed." The young prince's eyes widened in surprise. He had hoped his father would approve the idea, but he hadn't expected to be given actual responsibility for implementing it. Me? But father, I'm only 8 years old. How can I develop a program for the entire palace staff? You'll have help, of course, King Edmund replied with a smile. Captain Morrison will assist with the administrative details, and the palace treasurer will handle the financial aspects. But the vision and principles will come from you. You've identified a real need and proposed a solution. Now you must see it through to completion. Thomas looked between father and son with amazement. He had never imagined that his personal crisis would lead to such a significant development in palace policy. The idea that an 8-year-old prince would be tasked with creating a program to help staff members seemed almost too remarkable to believe. What exactly would I need to do? Alexander asked, his excitement mixing with nervousness at the enormous responsibility being placed on his young shoulders. First, you'll work with Captain Morrison to survey all palace employees about their potential needs and concerns, the king explained. Then you'll draft clear guidelines about what types of emergencies qualify for assistance, how much aid can be provided, and what the application process should look like. Alexander nodded eagerly, his mind already racing with ideas and possibilities. How soon do you want this completed, father? Take your time to do it properly, King Edmund replied. A program like this must be carefully planned to be effective and fair. I'd expect a preliminary proposal within 3 months, with implementation beginning 6 months from now. Thomas listened to this conversation with growing excitement. Not only was his own family being saved, but his crisis was leading to help for countless other palace employees who might face similar situations in the future. The guard felt honored to be part of such an important development. Your Majesty, Thomas said respectfully, would it be appropriate for me to assist Prince Alexander with this project? I could help identify the types of emergencies that staff members commonly face. The king considered this suggestion thoughtfully. An excellent idea, Guard Hartwell. Your perspective as both a beneficiary and a member of the staff would be valuable. Consider yourself temporarily assigned to assist Prince Alexander with this project, in addition to your regular duties. Alexander's face lit up at the prospect of working with Thomas on the program. The guard's practical experience and understanding of staff concerns would be invaluable in creating something truly helpful rather than just well-intentioned. There's one more thing, the king continued, his expression becoming more serious. Alexander, this program will be your first real test of leadership. How you handle this responsibility will determine whether you're ready for greater challenges in the future. Many people will be watching to see if you can follow through on your commitments. The weight of his father's words settled on Alexander's shoulders, but rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt energized by the challenge. This was his opportunity to prove that his compassion could be paired with effective action, that his royal privileges could be used to make a real difference in people's lives. I won't let you down, father, Alexander said with quiet determination, and I won't let down the people who will depend on this program. I believe you'll succeed, King Edmund replied warmly. But remember, leadership isn't just about having good intentions. It's about making difficult decisions, managing limited resources, and sometimes disappointing people when their requests can't be fulfilled. Are you prepared for those challenges? Alexander thought carefully before answering. He had witnessed his father making tough decisions as king, and he understood that leadership often required saying no, even when you wanted to say yes. I think I understand, father. We can't help everyone, but we should help everyone we reasonably can, and we should be fair and honest about our limitations. Precisely, the king said approvingly. Now let's take care of the immediate matter at hand. Thomas, I'll have the royal treasurer prepare a bank draft for 300 gold pieces. You'll need to leave immediately to reach your village in time to settle your family's debt. Thomas's relief was visible, as the reality of his family's salvation fully sank in. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll depart as soon as the arrangements are made. Captain Morrison will adjust the guard schedules to cover your absence, the king continued. Take whatever time you need to ensure your family's situation is completely resolved. Alexander watched this exchange with satisfaction, but also with a growing understanding of the complexities involved in leadership decisions. His father had not only solved Thomas's immediate problem, but had also considered the broader implications for palace operations and staff morale. Father, Alexander said thoughtfully, when I'm developing the assistance program, should I include provisions for emergency leave like you've just granted to Thomas? King Edmund smiled at his son's astute observation. Another excellent question. What do you think would be appropriate? I think we should allow emergency leave for family crises, but with limits to ensure palace operations aren't disrupted, Alexander replied after considering the matter. Maybe up to 1 week for immediate family emergencies with longer leave requiring special approval. Sound reasoning, the king agreed. You're already thinking like a leader, considering both compassion and practicality. Thomas stepped forward, his expression solemn but grateful. Your Majesty, Prince Alexander, I want you both to know that this kindness will never be forgotten by my family. My children and grandchildren will hear the story of how the royal family saved us in our darkest hour. Your faithful service earned this assistance, Alexander replied earnestly. You've always been kind to me, Thomas, even when you had your own worries. Good people should be able to count on each other, especially during difficult times. The king watched this exchange with obvious pride in his son's character. At only 8 years old, Alexander was demonstrating the empathy and sense of justice that would serve him well as a future ruler. The boy's willingness to take on real responsibility rather than just offering empty sympathy showed promise for his development as a leader. Now, King Edmund said, turning to practical matters, Thomas, you should prepare for your journey while the treasurer arranges the payment. Alexander, you should return to your lessons for today, but tomorrow we'll begin planning your new project. As they prepared to leave the king's study, Alexander felt a profound sense of accomplishment, mixed with anticipation for the work ahead. He had not only helped a friend in need, but had also convinced his father to create a program that could help many others in the future. Thomas, Alexander said as they walked through the palace corridors, when you come back from saving your family, I want to hear all about your village and the other families there. If we're going to create a program to help palace employees, I need to understand what kinds of problems they face. Thomas nodded enthusiastically. I'll be happy to share everything I know, Your Highness, and I'll ask other guards about their experiences too. Many of them have families in various provinces facing different challenges. As they parted ways, Alexander heading to find his tutor, and Thomas going to arrange his departure. Both felt that the day had marked a turning point. Thomas's family crisis had revealed the need for systematic support for palace employees, and Alexander's response had demonstrated the kind of leadership that could make such support a reality. The young prince walked through the palace halls with a new sense of purpose, understanding for the first time that being royal meant having the power to solve problems, not just enjoy privileges. His command to his father had changed everything, not just for Thomas's family, but for the entire palace community that would benefit from the program he was now responsible for creating. 3 days later, Alexander eagerly awaited Thomas's return from his village. The young prince had spent the time productively, beginning his research into the assistance program by interviewing other palace staff members about their needs and concerns. What he discovered both surprised and motivated him further. During conversations with cooks, housekeepers, gardeners, and other guards, Alexander learned that many employees faced ongoing struggles that he had never imagined. Some sent most of their wages home to support elderly parents or sick relatives. Others worked extra hours to afford medicine for their children. Several had delayed getting married or starting families because they couldn't afford to support them on their palace salaries. The prince also discovered that pride often prevented people from seeking help, even when assistance might be available. Many staff members assumed that their personal problems weren't important enough to trouble the royal family with, so they suffered in silence rather than asking for support. When Thomas finally returned to the palace, his transformation was remarkable. The despair and worry that had consumed him just days earlier had been replaced by joy and relief. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, and his smile genuine as he reported to Captain Morrison for duty. Thomas, Alexander called out when he spotted the guard in the courtyard. How did everything go with your family? Thomas's face lit up as he saw the young prince approaching. Your Highness, I can't begin to tell you how grateful my family is. When I arrived with the money to pay off the debt, my father actually cried. He said he had given up hope of saving the farm. Alexander felt warmth spread through his chest at Thomas's words. Tell me everything that happened. I want to hear about your family and your village. As they walked through the palace gardens, Thomas shared the details of his journey home. His family's farm was small but productive in good years, providing grain and vegetables for the local community. The drought had been devastating not just for his family, but for the entire region, leaving many farmers struggling to survive. My sisters were so thin, Thomas said, his voice heavy with emotion. They had been eating only one meal a day, so there would be enough food for our grandmother and parents. When I arrived with money for food as well as the debt payment, it was like watching flowers bloom after rain. Alexander listened intently, gaining a deeper understanding of the hardships faced by ordinary people throughout the kingdom. The prince had grown up surrounded by abundance where food was plentiful and comfort was guaranteed. Hearing about families rationing their meals and facing homelessness made him more determined than ever to make the assistance program effective. "What about the other families in your village?" Alexander asked. "Are they facing similar problems?" "Many of them," Thomas replied sadly. "The blacksmith's wife is sick and needs expensive medicine that they can't afford. The miller's son broke his leg and can't work, so the family has no income. 3 families have already lost their homes and moved away to find work in other provinces." The scope of the suffering troubled Alexander deeply, but it also reinforced his conviction that the palace had a responsibility to help its employees protect their families from such hardships. Each story Thomas shared represented a potential future beneficiary of the assistance program. "I've been talking to people here at the palace too," Alexander told Thomas as they settled on a bench in the garden. "Did you know that Maria in the kitchen sends half her wages to her sick mother? Or that Peter the stable boy is trying to save money to buy medicine for his younger brother?" Thomas nodded knowingly. "Palace employees often carry heavy burdens, Your Highness. We don't talk about our problems much because we don't want to seem ungrateful for our positions, but many of us struggle to support our families on our wages." This revelation sparked a new idea in Alexander's mind. What if the assistance program included more than just emergency grants? What if we also looked at ways to help people with ongoing financial pressures? "How do you mean?" Thomas asked, intrigued by the prince's suggestion. "Well, maybe we could provide interest-free loans for medical expenses, or help with educational costs for employees' children, or even offer small salary advances when people face temporary hardships," Alexander explained enthusiastically. Thomas's eyes widened at the ambitious scope of what the prince was proposing. "Those are wonderful ideas, Your Highness, but wouldn't such a comprehensive program be very expensive?" "It might be," Alexander admitted. "But think about how much more effective our staff would be if they weren't constantly worried about their family's welfare. People work better when they feel secure and valued." The conversation was interrupted by Captain Morrison, who approached with a document in his hand. "Prince Alexander, I have the preliminary survey results you requested from the palace staff." Alexander accepted the papers eagerly, scanning the responses that had been collected from employees throughout the palace. The survey had asked about family size, financial obligations, potential emergency needs, and suggestions for assistance programs. "This is fascinating," Alexander murmured as he read through the responses. "Look at this, Thomas. Nearly half of our employees support family members who don't live at the palace, and almost everyone has faced at least one financial emergency in the past 2 years." Thomas peered over the prince's shoulder at the survey results, amazed by the comprehensive picture they painted of staff needs. "I had no idea so many people were dealing with similar challenges to mine." Captain Morrison nodded gravely. "The responses were quite eye-opening, Your Highness. Many employees expressed surprise that anyone was interested in their personal circumstances. Several mentioned that they had never felt comfortable discussing financial difficulties with their supervisors. That's exactly the problem we need to solve," Alexander declared. "People shouldn't have to suffer in silence because they're afraid to ask for help. We need to create a system that makes it easy and dignified for employees to seek assistance when they need it." The prince stood up suddenly, his mind racing with ideas sparked by the survey results. "Captain Morrison, I want to schedule meetings with department heads throughout the palace. I need to understand how different types of employees might benefit from various forms of assistance." "Certainly, Your Highness. I'll arrange those meetings for next week," Captain Morrison replied, making notes on his papers, and Thomas Alexander continued, turning to the guard. "I want you to help me interview volunteers from each department. People need to hear from someone who has actually benefited from royal assistance, not just from a prince who has never faced financial hardship." Thomas straightened with pride at being given such an important role in the program's development. "I would be honored to help in any way I can, Your Highness." As they discussed the next steps in developing the assistance program, Alexander felt a growing sense of excitement about the project. What had started as a simple desire to help one friend in crisis was evolving into a comprehensive support system that could improve the lives of hundreds of palace employees. There's something else I want to include in the program, Alexander announced suddenly. Recognition and appreciation events for employees who have served faithfully for many years. People like Thomas should be celebrated for their dedication, not just helped when they face emergencies. Captain Morrison looked impressed by the prince's thoughtful approach. That's an excellent addition, Your Highness. Employee recognition programs can boost morale and demonstrate that their service is valued. Exactly, Alexander agreed. This shouldn't just be about solving problems. It should be about showing people that we truly care about their welfare and appreciate their contributions to our household. Thomas felt deeply moved by the prince's commitment to honoring long-serving employees. The young boy's empathy and wisdom continued to amaze him, and he felt privileged to be part of developing such a meaningful program. Your Highness, Thomas said thoughtfully, perhaps we could also create opportunities for employees to advance their skills or train for better positions within the palace. Many people would benefit from educational opportunities as much as financial assistance. Alexander's eyes lit up at this suggestion. Yes, we could offer tutoring for employees who want to learn to read and write, or training programs for people who want to develop new skills. That would help people improve their long-term prospects, not just solve immediate problems. The scope of the program was growing more ambitious by the day, but Alexander felt confident that it was the right approach. Rather than creating a simple charity fund, they were developing a comprehensive support system that would strengthen the entire palace community. 6 months later, the Palace Employee Assistance Program was officially launched with a ceremony in the main courtyard. Alexander, now 9 years old, stood beside his father as they addressed the assembled staff. The young prince had grown visibly during his months of work on the program, not just physically but in confidence and leadership presence. Today marks the beginning of a new era in our palace community, Alexander announced to the crowd of employees gathered before him. His voice carried clearly across the courtyard, stronger and more assured than it had been during his first meeting with his father about Thomas's crisis. The program that had emerged from Alexander's vision was comprehensive and carefully structured. Emergency grants were available for genuine crises, with a simple application process that preserved applicants' dignity. Interest-free loans helped employees handle medical expenses and other temporary hardships. Educational opportunities included literacy classes, skill training programs, and even scholarships for employees' children. Thomas stood among the crowd, wearing a new uniform that designated his role as Employee Liaison Coordinator. His position had been created specifically to help other staff members navigate the assistance program and to ensure that the leadership understood ongoing employee needs. The former guard had proven himself to be an articulate advocate for his fellow workers. The program we're launching today exists because one person had the courage to show his distress rather than hide it. Alexander continued, his eyes finding Thomas in the crowd. Thomas Hartwell's family crisis opened our eyes to the struggles that many of you face every day. His willingness to accept help and our household's ability to provide it proved that we are truly a community that cares for all its members. King Edmund watched his son with obvious pride as Alexander confidently addressed the assembly. The boy had exceeded all expectations during the development process, showing remarkable maturity in handling the complex negotiations between competing interests and limited resources. The program's guidelines were fair but clear. Emergency assistance was available to employees who had served at least 1 year and faced genuine crises beyond their control. A committee of senior staff members, chaired by Thomas, reviewed applications and made recommendations. The king retained final approval authority, but in practice, he had yet to overrule any of the committee's decisions. Over the past 6 months, we've learned that this palace functions best when everyone feels secure and valued, Alexander said, warming to his theme. When Maria in the kitchen doesn't have to worry about her mother's medical bills, she can focus on preparing excellent meals. When Peter in the stables knows that his brother will receive the education he needs, Peter can give his full attention to caring for our horses. The crowd murmured appreciatively at these references to specific employees, many of whom had already benefited from the new program. Maria wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered the relief she had felt when the committee approved assistance for her mother's expensive treatments. Peter stood straighter with pride, knowing that his younger brother was now attending school thanks to an educational scholarship. Captain Morrison stepped forward to provide details about the program's practical operations.
Applications are available in my office and from Mr. Hartwell. We've designed the process to be simple and respectful,
requiring only basic information about your situation and your proposed solution. Alexander had insisted on this streamlined approach after learning that complex bureaucracy often prevented people from seeking help when they needed it most. The application required just 2 pages of information and promised a decision within 1 week of submission. The program operates on principles of mutual responsibility, the captain continued. We provide assistance to help you overcome genuine hardships, and we expect continued dedicated service in return. This is not charity, but rather an investment in our palace community. Thomas was invited to speak next, representing the employee perspective on the program. He had become an effective public speaker during his months of interviewing staff members and advocating for their needs. When Prince Alexander found me crying in the courtyard 6 months ago, I thought my world was ending, Thomas began, his voice carrying emotional weight that resonated with the assembled crowd. My family was about to lose everything and I felt powerless to help them. I never imagined that my personal crisis would lead to something that could help all of us. He paused, looking around at faces he now knew well from countless conversations about their hopes and struggles. This program exists because a young prince saw a problem and refused to accept that nothing could be done about it. But it succeeds because all of you had the courage to share your stories and help design something that really works. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, many employees thinking of their own interactions with Thomas during the development process. He had visited every department, listened to every concern, and advocated tirelessly for solutions that addressed real needs rather than theoretical problems. The most important thing I've learned, Thomas continued, is that we don't have to face our troubles alone anymore. This palace truly is a community, and communities take care of their members. King Edmund then stepped forward to make the program's launch official. I hereby formally establish the Palace Employee Assistance Program, with Prince Alexander serving as its director, and Thomas Hartwell as its coordinator. This program represents our commitment to the welfare of every person who serves our household. The king's announcement was met with sustained applause, but Alexander felt the weight of ongoing responsibility, rather than just satisfaction at achieving a goal. The program's success would be measured not by its launch, but by its effectiveness in helping people over the months and years to come. After the ceremony, Alexander walked through the palace halls with a new understanding of his role as a future leader. The past 6 months had taught him that good intentions meant nothing without effective implementation, that listening was often more important than speaking, and that real leadership required constant attention to the needs of those you served. Thomas, Alexander said as they reviewed the first batch of applications that had been submitted even before the official launch, do you think we've created something that will really make a difference? Thomas smiled at the question, remembering the desperate young guard who had sat crying on a bench just 6 months earlier. Your Highness, yesterday I received a letter from my father. He wrote to thank you again for saving our farm, but he also mentioned something else. He said that word has spread to neighboring villages about what happened here, and other landowners are being more patient with families facing hardships. Alexander's eyes widened at this unexpected news. Really? Our program is influencing people outside the palace. Your example of caring for your people is inspiring others to do the same, Thomas explained. That's the mark of true leadership, Your Highness. When your actions encourage others to be more compassionate, the impact spreads far beyond what you directly control. As Alexander absorbed this lesson, he realized that his command to help Thomas's family had indeed changed everything, not just for the palace staff, but potentially for countless other people who would benefit from the example of leadership through service. The young prince looked out the window at the courtyard, where he had first encountered Thomas in distress, remembering the boy he had been just 6 months earlier, that Alexander had acted from instinct and emotion, moved by immediate sympathy for a friend's suffering. The Alexander who stood there now understood that lasting change required more than momentary compassion. It demanded sustained commitment, careful planning, and the willingness to accept responsibility for the welfare of others. His transformation from sympathetic child to effective leader had begun with a simple decision to help one person in need, but it would continue for the rest of his life as he learned to use his privileges in service of others. the Palace Employee Assistance program would eventually serve as a model for similar programs throughout the kingdom, but its true significance lay in the lesson it taught a young prince about the nature of leadership. Power was not meant to be hoarded or displayed, but rather used to lift up others and create communities where everyone could thrive. Years later, when Alexander became king, he would implement social programs throughout the kingdom, based on the principles he had learned during those 6 months of developing the Palace Assistance Program. But he would always remember that it all began with observing a guard in distress and having the courage to give a command that changed everything.